Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. I'm a former journalist who's now using this show to uncover amazing and insightful stories simply through asking questions, while also giving you an example of what it means to listen more than you speak so that you can become a more thoughtful and informed person. On the Follow-Up Question podcast, I'll talk with some of the best interviewers I know to get their perspective on what it means to ask amazing questions. I'll also interview people from all different backgrounds and perspectives who have amazing stories to tell, and I'll bring those stories to you by asking thoughtful, logical questions. Whether you're a journalist, a podcaster yourself, a blogger, someone who wants to learn how to be quick to listen and slow to speak, or someone who just likes to hear great stories, this is the show for you. This week on the show, I welcome a former professor of mine from Kansas State University, Dr. Kimetris Baltrip. Kim came to Kansas State University in 2005 as the faculty student newspaper advisor after the previous advisor, Ron Johnson, had been dismissed in May of 2004 after kind of a bit of a controversy over coverage in the student newspaper over Black student issues, or I should say a lack of coverage. And there were a lot of different things that were thrown about as to the real reason why Ron Johnson was dismissed. But that eventually led to a couple former newspaper editors at the student newspaper suing the school over Ron Johnson's dismissal. That made its way through the court system. And eventually that case kind of faded away and no real decision was ever reached. But when Kim came to Kansas State, she was the first female racial minority to serve as the newspaper advisor of the Kansas State Collegian, the student newspaper. And she came into a little bit of a hotbed of tension over everything that had gone on at the student newspaper. And this happened to coincide with my time as a very young journalism student at the student newspaper. And Kim and I immediately struck up a very close friendship. I enjoyed her perspective. Kim came to Kansas State after having spent time at the New York Times as a copy editor. She had spent time at the Houston Chronicle. You know, this is someone who has her bachelor's degree in mass communications from Prairie View A&M, a historically Black college and university, and her master's in mass communications and her doctoral in higher education administration from Akron University. And, you know, she came into a very tense situation. And what you'll hear in our conversation is her experience through all of that. Over the course of, I believe she was at Kansas State a little over 10 years. I want to say it was maybe closer to 12 or 13 years. She experienced so much in terms of racial division, in terms of expectations from different sides over what her role and what her job ultimately would be in advising the student newspaper. And for me, again, as a young journalism student at the time of her hiring, I admittedly was oblivious to it. I did not see the full picture. And so to hear everything that Kim went through in having this conversation for this interview, it was quite remarkable. It was very eye-opening to hear everything that she went through, that she experienced even after I left Kansas State. And ultimately, you know, now that she's no longer at Kansas State, this is the first I've heard of many of these stories that Kim talks about in this interview. And she had a long run at Kansas State, and it's amazing. She served for 4 years as the faculty student newspaper advisor. She received awards for the work that she did in making a more diverse newsroom and advising the students and the young journalists in that way. In her time as the faculty advisor, the Kansas State Collegian had its first Asian American and first African American editors-in-chief of the newspaper, and both of them were women, in addition to other minorities that were also serving in managerial roles. So her time there was not all for naught, but it's amazing to hear just everything that coming into that situation where she was replacing a very beloved faculty newspaper advisor, one that was actually in the midst of suing the very school where she was now teaching, having lost the job that she was now filling as a Black woman. And because of the issues that had ultimately led to the previous faculty advisor's dismissal, or the perceived issues, one way or the other, you can make the decision for yourself. I've linked some resources in the show notes so you can actually read a little bit more about the situation and everything that happened with the lawsuits. But it's incredible to hear the story from Kim's angle as the one experiencing it from the outside and trying to break in and trying to break into what was, as I've mentioned, a very tense situation. So the point of this show, guys, is to bring experiences to light and to bring different perspectives to light, to the forefront, and let those experiences speak for themselves. And I can't think of a better way to kick off the interviews for the follow-up question for this show than with this one with Dr. Kim Baltrip. Enjoy it, guys. You left Kansas State how many years ago now? How long has it been?
I've been 2018.
All right, so a couple years now. And what are you doing now? What are you up to now?
Oh my goodness. I am a teacher in secondary education. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I am at a private school in Houston, and I teach journalism to ninth, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. So, where I am, journalism is an elective. And if you're in high school, it's very much like K State in that you do not have to have any journalism background. You just get in and we grow our own. So, I have students in all grade levels in high
And
school.
was the plan to get back to Texas and to get it? How did that come about? What was the what was the path you took to go from Kansas State to, you're from Texas, right?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. What was the plan there?
Yes, the plan was to come back to Houston, and to be honest with you, I've been wanting to come back to Houston for about a decade, and it didn't work out. It just didn't work out. And I applied. There's more to the story, but I'll just cut to the chase. I applied to this job in Houston really kind of on a fluke. I was just online looking around, trying to see what kind of journalism jobs were available in Houston, preferably, of course, in higher education, since that's where most of my experience is from.
Yeah.
And I happened to see that the Kincaid School was looking for a journalism and yearbook teacher. And I was thinking, well, I've never taught a yearbook before, but I'm a journalism teacher. And I read the job description. And honestly, I just said to myself, maybe I'll try it and just see what happens.
Yeah.
I can't say that I felt that it would really materialize, but I visited the campus. I had a great interview. I thought the students were sensational. And the faculty, they all seemed, I'm in the arts department at this particular institution. And so I'm around all these creatives, and they felt like creatives when I interviewed for the job. They felt very artsy, they were very friendly, and wonderful, very inviting. And I was just for an interview, and I still got that sense. I thought the director was phenomenal. And so I left feeling like, that was a pleasant experience. And so, fortunately, I was blessed with the offer and I gave it a go. So that's where I've been for 2 years now.
That sounds like almost the exact opposite of the situation that you walked into at Kansas State. when you
Absolutely.
when you were going through the interview process at Kansas State and applying for that job, did you know the situation and the scenario of what you were getting into there?
I did. And actually, my boss at the New York Times, he actually said to me, because he knew I was interviewing, and he said, Kim, you know what happened there, don't you? I said, well, yes. And, I read the backstory. But again, being very green, being very naive, I literally said to myself, well, I love everyone. So all the people there will get to know me, and they'll know that I don't have an agenda, that I'm only here to be a journalist. And I love everybody. And I'm just a cool person to be around. I mean, I'm thinking all these things, and I'm thinking, in no time they'll get to know me. They'll see it. It won't be a problem. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
But during the interview process, it was very clear to me that there were some preconceived notions about me from a lot of different perspectives. I do know that because my predecessor was so loved and people were endeared to him, which they really should have been.
Hmm.
I respect that and completely understand that. Transition is very, very difficult. I've lost directors and bosses and leaders and literally cried, because I didn't want them to go. So the fact that my predecessor was so loved was something that I was extremely sensitive to, and I understood that. Still, the amount of hostility that I faced, the virtual sit-in that I encountered in the a newsroom during my interview was something I was completely ill prepared for. I don't think I understood the depth of hurt and discord that there was when I interviewed. I had no inkling that the embers were very, 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 very much still very warm, hot. Um, yeah.
Describe what you just talked about, that sit-in. What was the scenario there?
I walked into the newsroom and it was packed. I mean, probably the only time in all my years at Kansas State that I ever saw the student newsroom ass full is probably on deadline night. But it was full of students. Every computer station was full. And there were some students even standing in the room. But when I walked in with a director at that time who introduced me, pretty much the students had their backs to me. They had decided that they were not going to really engage in the interview process. And it was very clear to me that it seemed to be a concerted effort. Like this was a decision that they had made. This is a decision that some leader in the newsroom had decided when this particular candidate comes, we're going to all be there. If we have to skip class, whatever we have to do, we're going to all be there. And we are not going to engage this woman. And I was surprised. Um, it felt like a setup.
Hmm.
And I brushed it off as much as I could, to maintain my composure and professionalism. But I do recall right after that moment, I called my father and I said, there is no way I'm coming to Kansas State University. No way possible. But I did,
You obviously
partly
did, and
because of his encouragement.
yeah, I definitely want to hear what that conversation was like. You mentioned earlier you were fighting a lot of preconceived notions.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
I don't know, but if there were some conversations about who I was before I came to campus in person, they had to be around the fact that I was probably African American or definitely African American, that I was from I have a historically black college and HBCU background,
Hmm.
which stands for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. Not only was I a graduate from an HBCU, but I also taught at an HBCU prior to going to Kansas State University. In fact, it's where I had my other journalism professor job. I was a professor at Prairie View A&M University for 4 years, and that was my alma mater. So, having spent 13 years at Kansas State, I realized that when candidates come in, they do make their vita available to people who want to review them. So it seemed apparent to me that my background had pretty much been scrubbed bear, and that students were anticipating an African American woman with an HBCU background. And I don't know what that meant to students, but I do know that because of the racial discord that happened on campus prior to my coming to Kansas State University, the fact that I was African American was a big deal. I do know for a fact that some people at Kansas State thought that my candidacy and my eventual hiring was like a panacea. Like,
Mm-hmm.
here is this African American woman that they're bringing in to pacify the African American people on campus. And what was so hurtful about that was no one paid attention to my credentials. It was as if my credentials didn't matter. No one seemed to care that I had been in higher education for a total of 6 years, 4 of those years as a journalism professor, that I had worked at the Houston Chronicle as a copy editor for 2 years, that I was interviewing while still employed at the New York Times, where I was both a reporter and a copy editor. And those credentials just did not seem to matter whatsoever. I was an African American woman walking into basically a landmine, a situation where the field was just full of them. And it was, I just say, it was very, very difficult, very hurtful. And it was the first time in my life where I really understood how people, um, I should say the intersection between like race and everything else in the world. It was my first real encounter. I had had little silly things that had been said to me, here and there over the course of my life. But it was the first time where I was in a situation where my race really, really mattered to people on both sides. It mattered to Black people that I was there. I remember the smiles and the welcome and it's great that you're here. And I also felt that they saw the color of my skin. They didn't understand that I was not there to serve any community except the campus community. I was there as a journalist, and we teach as much as we can that our pursuit is objectivity. So I could not have a platform for the people of color on campus. I couldn't have a platform for anyone. My stage was one that whose foundation was freedom of the press, First Amendment, um, and that was it. But no one cared about that really. It was purely political from the time that I started until the time that I left K State.
I was such a young editor at the time on the paper, and in the same way, like what you just described, it was as a white man from Kansas. It's kind of maybe shocking to say this, but that was really my first encounter of a situation like this as well. And I was so new to the paper that I didn't understand what had gone on in the previous semesters regarding First Amendment and the dismissal of Ron Johnson, who was your predecessor, and the lawsuit that was going on. And it's so crazy to hear you describe walking into the newsroom, because I remember when you did walk into the newsroom, I was in there, and I remember being so excited that we were going to have somebody who was working at the New York Times come and interview for this role of being the student publications advisor. And it just shows you like how we can go so long with blinders on. You mentioned the interactions that you had with your students at your current the Kincaid School. were there any student interactions that stood out at Kansas State that seemed genuine at the time?
Yeah, yours, absolutely.
That
You
was not a
were,
setup, by the way. I appreciate that, but that's not a setup.
and that is so true, though. Seriously, I clearly remember the moment that we met that day, and you greeted me with a smile and an outstretched hand. And I could be wrong, but I think you were the only one who did that. I could be
That's
wrong.
a shame.
And as time went on, things became better, but I would say that that was only after I left the newspaper.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
I dealt with a succession of editors who, for whatever reason, had a really hard time with my leadership. And that was hard. It was really hard, which is one reason why I gave up the post after 4 years. I also felt like I'd done great work in helping the first African American student to ever become editor in chief of the paper. And so it was a sort of passing the baton on to her. And then after her, we had an Asian American editor in chief for the summer. And then we had an African American male who was editor in chief. And it just went on and on. So I felt as if whatever work needed to be done that had not been done, not to pacify people of color at Kansas State, but because journalism should be representative throughout the world, it should be. I felt as if my tenure with the paper accomplished that end. And so I could raise my son, who was born after 4 years, without having to deal with the stress that came with a succession of editors who, for whatever reason, did not hold high esteem for my position.
Kim, you've mentioned several times the First Amendment, and you mentioned reporters and editors being object in bringing objectivity into their reporting and their editing. There was an argument I remember early on brought against you that you were brought in to censor or heavily edit the content of the newspaper. Being a journalist for being a professional journalist for as long as you had been, how did that make you feel that those kinds of accusations were levied against you?
It's so interesting because journalists typically will call out public relations professionals for spin.
Yeah.
And what's so sad in today's journalistic climate is that we are the spin doctors. It is so sad. It's in our writing. Um, some of the major newspapers, I will call no names, but I read spin all the time on the front page, top center of the web page, left front of the web page, or on television. It's really, really saddening to me. So what happened is, if anyone knows HBCUs, they typically don't have the amount of support and the amount of structure, the amount of finances and resources that traditionally white institutions have. So when I interviewed for the job at my alma mater, the newspaper
We have a
was
guest.
virtually defunct. It was virtually defunct. It was unbelievable. So we had to breathe some air back into it. It was also a very challenging sort of turnaround, but we were able to do that. But what that also meant is that there were some very inexperienced editors that I had to choose from. All of them were very inexperienced. And so they relied very heavily on my leadership, not just as a professor, but to teach them editing, to teach them what integrity in writing, to teach them organization skills and all these sorts of things, because the resources just weren't there. There weren't enough faculty around. I mean, the department that I came from, was a quarter of the size of what we had at Kansas State. So when the interview question was, well, what is your approach to, advising a student newspaper? And I shared that experience.
I
Well,
remember.
I mean, literally at my former institution, I stayed up late into the night with my students, side by side with them, editing. I mean, I didn't get home until 11:30, midnight, 12:30. I put the paper to bed alongside them. They welcomed that oversight. They wanted it. They appreciated it. They invited it. It's not because I wanted to command their power or their voice. It had nothing to do with that. And so I shared that that was my experience. And so when students heard that, or when whoever was involved in the interview process heard that, they took that to mean that there was, going to be some major hand holding or stripping of their voice. I was going to mute their rights. And it was completely misconstrued and taken out of context, completely. And it was so difficult for them to unhear that because there was this groupthink, a collective decision. Oh, well, did you hear what she said? Oh, and there was no disputing that I'd said those things, but I never said that I was going to bring that to Kansas State University and wield it as some superpower or something. This was what my experience was,
Yeah.
But with every job change, there's a new system or there's a new standard. I mean, trust me, I loved going home at 5 or 5:30. It was great. Are you telling me you don't want me in the newsroom? You got it. I mean, I'm thinking that's the best thing ever. I could go home and eat dinner at a decent time. No problem there. Um, so yeah, it was hard. It was hard because no one wanted to unhear that. So my first year was just, I will tell you the truth, something I never said. I spent my whole, probably at least my first year, Kansas State wanting to leave the entire year. It was, yeah.
You often critiqued the paper with
Yeah.
using a well, every day you did using a purple felt tip pen. Do you still have that felt tip pen? You still use that?
I do. I have more purple pens. Can you believe that throughout my entire career, Royal Purple has been at every 4-year institution that I've worked at, and now it's also at the school that I work at now.
Oh my
Our
gosh.
colors are royal purple and gold. At Prairie View, the colors are purple and gold. It's crazy. So yeah, I still have purple all in my life.
I see a theme here, Kim.
Yeah, I don't know. I do too, and I feel as if every job that I apply for, if purple's not in it, I mean, I think that's the indication. Don't even think about it.
In those critiques where you would write on the actual newspaper print, I know people probably listening are like, what the heck is a newspaper? But you would write your critiques or questions after the fact, after the story had been published. So there was no like editing pre-hand. Did you ever pull back on your critiques or edit yourself in those critiques because of the situation?
Well, one of the best teaching tools that I discovered and I still love is when I write a critique and a student comes back and says, Dr. Baltrip, that's not right. Or that's not what I meant. Or this is what I was trying to do. It is one of the best teaching tools ever. And I absolutely love when students push back and they're correct. It is the best ever because I'm thinking, not only did you make a great journalistic decision, but you could defend it. And I'm thinking, wow, you have a great future ahead of you if you can defend it. And I say, you're absolutely correct. So I don't think I pulled back. I don't like pulling back. I like to push hard. And it pleases me to no end when students push back harder. It's great.
That's great. So I want to go back to the conversation with your dad. With everything that you've talked
Yeah.
talked with up to this point, what
Mhm.
was that conversation like, and what ultimately made you decide to take the job at K-State?
You know what? Okay, so my dad died probably a month after I got to Kansas.
Oh, wow.
And I think he was up to something. I really do.
Hmm.
Uh, First of all, New York was sensational, and he was proud of my time in New York. And I think though that my mom and dad were never really comfortable with me being in New York for whatever reason. I think they didn't think it was the safest place, and they weren't real fond of having a daughter going up and down the street of going up and down Times Square back and forth
Yeah.
by herself and living in Jersey. I know my parents, so I know they were worried. So I also believe that my father knew that he was sick and he didn't tell anyone. And I have reasons for believing that.
Yeah.
So I really believe, because he said something strange when I was transitioning from New York, well, Manhattan, Big Apple Manhattan to Little Apple Manhattan. He said something strange about having to get us all together and show us where stuff was, and I was like, "What? What are you talking about?" And he repeated that, and I just blew it off. Like, I don't know why he's saying that now. And so I think ultimately, honestly, I think he felt because he was sick and because he and my mom were worried and just really never said that, I think he felt, listen, if this is this girl's ticket out of Kansas, I mean, out of New York, just take it. Just get out of New York because I'm not well and I don't want your mother worrying and I don't want you in New York, by yourself. And he just said to me, "Oh, you'll be okay. It'll be fine." And I was thinking, no, it's not. I wanted him to say, "You're right. You don't have to stand for that. If they've showed you that through the interview process, it's only going to get worse. You don't want to, go into a situation where you can already sense and see very clearly what you're walking into." That's what I wanted him to say. That's not what he said. So I sort of sat down. I had talked to one of the principal people during the interview process, and who had said to me, "Well, what are you looking for in salary?" So I mentioned that, and the response was, "Well, that's about what we're offering." And so I was like, "Well, I kind of already know what the salary is. I've been wanting to get back into higher education for some time. My dad says it's going to be okay. So if I get the offer, I'll try. I'll just try." Also, feeling as if I have portable skills. So if I don't like it, I'll just leave. So that's kind of how it happened.
How quickly after you started did you begin to feel the tug in both directions, like you mentioned earlier, where you've got one group who was against your hire because they thought you were being hired for this specific reason, and another group who was for your hire because they thought you were like, how quickly did you feel that pull?
Oh, I don't know if it was late in my first year or around my second year, because at first there was no pool. At first it was like this affinity group, like, oh, there's another African American person who's been hired on campus. And so let's invite her into the group, into the crowd. And so then when I realized that they sort of had an agenda, well, okay, so people of color have been traditionally excluded from the paper, or when they have been written about, it's been very stereotypical, Or when they are written about, it's around athletics or entertainment. It's not that, they're achieving great things like other students. I mean, it's sort of like a side note. It's the football players or the basketball players. And so we need you to diversify coverage. I was thinking, that would be wonderful. It would be noble. But students at Kansas State have First Amendment rights, and I cannot force them to report on one thing or another. I can pitch ideas. We have budget meetings during which students talk about story ideas. I can do that, but that's all I can do. Well, African American culture is very different from that. Very patriarchal culture. Our culture says you respect your leaders, you respect your elders, and you respect your boss. And so the response was, I don't understand that.
Hmm.
You mean to tell me you cannot make them cover certain things? But wait, aren't you the advisor? Aren't they supposed to be following your directions and doing what you tell them to do? In the classroom, yes. But in the newsroom, they have First Amendment rights. I do not have any power over what they write. Only thing I could do is offer guidance. That was rejected by the African American community at K State. They felt as if I was a letdown. I was coming up with an excuse, and that basically I didn't understand that I was out of touch with my own culture, that I was out of touch with the historical problems that had happened at K State. And literally, I promise you, this is the craziest thing, all the way up until the year that I left. One of the most highly respected African American people on campus, he and I were having a conversation, and okay, at this time, I am no longer the editor of the paper. I mean, I'm sorry, the advisor for the paper. Sorry. And he was complaining about something that was written in the paper. Now, this is what's this? 2018 now. Okay, 2018.
Mm-hmm.
He was complaining about something that was written in the paper and was trying to offer some guidance to an African American student on how to respond. And he came to me seeking advice. I said, well, this is what I think you should do. And he said, well, I'm going to go talk to the advisor. I'm going to say, and I told him, I said, the advisor has no control. He said, what? I was like, I know the advisor has no control. I've been telling y'all this for 13 years. When I was the advisor, I explained this to you all. And he's like, I don't understand that. I mean, if you are the advisor, so our culture, for whatever reason at K State, just doesn't get it. I don't understand it. But I don't know. It's like unless you're in the journalism department, you just don't get it. So it was, and I think what happened is I feel like when that marriage broke up, when I was sort of kicked out of the club, when I was sort of disenfranchised, and I was, yeah, she's black, but she's not down with us. She's not, we can't trust her. She's not going to carry our voice. She's not going to really be a part of this fight with us. She's out of touch. When that happened, that was the most hurtful. I mean, the absolute most hurtful. I had two people, a faculty member who left K State before I did, and a student to tell me on the down low, Dr. Baltrip, they're saying some things about you. the Black community, things that were unflattering. I mean, things that were happening when the Black Faculty Staff Association had meetings. There was a conversation about me, and someone from that meeting came back and said, "Yeah, this is some stuff. Don't tell anybody I told you, but this is what they're saying about you." Then I had a student to come and say the same thing, and I was thinking, wow, I don't have anyone here. I'm on an island. I'm not trusted in either camp. And so it was a very isolated feeling. And in the journalism department, I remember there was a professor who said to me, I remember I was angry once because I just felt students were disrespecting me. And, at K State, everything's pretty casual. You can call your professors by first name. HBCUs, absolutely not. You will not call your professor Kim at an HBCU because that is not our culture. We don't do that. I mean, that's like going into a Black church and your pastor's name is Chuck Connor, Pastor Connor, and you walk in the church and say, "What's up, Chuck?" I mean, what? I mean, the grandma in the back is going to turn around and give you a backhand, or you're going to get hit across your head with that fan that she was using to keep herself cool. We don't play that in the Black church or in the Black community. Yeah. It's yes, ma'am, miss, mister, doctor. And so at K State, again, I'm trying to become assimilated with the culture. And so Kim is a thing. I'm like, okay, that's very different. I was never Kim at Prairie View A&M, but that's how they do it here. And I remember becoming so angry, just so tired of being disrespected, that I told my students, you will no longer call me Dr. Baltrip. And for some reason, it had gotten around the hallways of Kedzie Hall at K-State. Mm-hmm. And one of my colleagues, a professor, pulled me in and said, "So I heard that you're asking students to call you Dr. Baltrip." And I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, it was just like nowhere to turn. I mean, I had no love at K-State. It was just issues. I had no breathing room to be a journalist, no breathing room to be African American, no breathing room to be a Christian who just wanted to love everybody. It was sickening. It was terrible and hurtful and eye-opening. And it wasn't just on campus. It was in the community where my neighbor didn't like me passing in front of his house. I integrated this street, and he told me that instead of passing, we had an HOA meeting, and it was at his house in his driveway, and I was the only Black person there. And he said the neighborhood used to be quiet, and and when the neighbor said, "Well, what's changed?" He said, "Well, there's somebody in our neighborhood who keeps coming down and passing by my house." And I was like, "Wait a second." I said, "Are you talking about me?" He said, "Yes." And I said, "What am I doing?" He said, "Well, you get your mail and then you come by my house to drive back to your house," because the street was a cul-de-sac. And another woman in the neighborhood said, "What do you want her to do?" And he said, "I want her to do a 3-point turn," which means he wanted me to back up, pull up, back up, and then go back to my house. He did not want me passing in front of his house after I got my mail. The cluster box was close to where his house was, and he wanted me to do a 3-point turn to go back to my house instead of passing in front of his. You would think I had loud music playing, or there was nothing of that nature. I had no children. All I had was a dog based at the neighborhood. So anyway, believe it or not, he packed his house up, sold it, and moved out of the neighborhood. It was crazy, and I had a situation where I was stopped once in Kansas. I mean, so Kansas changed me, but I'm so grateful that it changed me for the better. I could have been, there are a lot of situations that made me bitter for a time. But I didn't leave Kansas State bitter. I left Kansas State with this weird mixed up, entangled, crazy love affair. You would think that after being there for 13 years and encountering what I encountered at the university and in the city, that Kansas would be the last place I would ever want to be. But it isn't. There are beautiful people there. There are people in Kansas whom I love. And what happened was I decided that the only way to really effect change across racial division is to embrace the platform of Jesus Christ. That is what God showed me ultimately, because being embroiled in the politics at K State, it's never ending. Here in Houston, as I follow what's happening on campus at K State, I read things. I read the news. I watch WIPW. I'm still very much engaged in what's happening there because there are people there whom I love. And I care about what's happening there because I joke with one of my friends and say, I was born in Houston, but I was raised in Kansas. And that's because I learned so many life lessons there. And so the never ending racial tension and prejudice and discrimination and hatred and bigotry, all those things will be with the world forever. It will never end, ever. So, because that is so tiring, it's so taxing, and because it must be fought, I don't have the privilege of lying down and closing my eyes and saying, I'm just going to sleep on this issue and never deal with it. There's no way to escape it. So, because of that, I realized that my only hope, my only peace, the only way to find balance is to embrace a gospel of love. And it can't be my dirty old love. It can't be, because my love is fickle, right? Because if you hurt my feelings, I'm not going to love you for a day. All right.
Yep.
Or I'm going to, bitterness is going to seep in until I can forgive you and get past it. I am not going to like that you deal with the color of my skin the way that you do. And so the only way that I can love you through your faults and shortcomings, and the only way I can even love myself through my own, is to understand what the love of Christ really means, what it means for me to be able to forgive myself, and what it means for me to be able to give other people. And so I took that approach. Although I dealt with campus racial discord for 13 years, and I'm still dealing with it now at the campus I'm at now. Like I said, it's going to be everywhere. But I took that understanding and that wisdom, I believe, to the community, to the church that I belong to. I left a predominantly Black church in Manhattan and I joined a predominantly white church because I wanted to make a difference. I felt as if people are this ignorant about who I am and what I represent, what I bring to the table. They see the color of my skin and don't understand that my blood is red, that we all have the same, innate desires in this world. If I'm that misunderstood, that means that I need to put myself in a situation where I'm exposing them to me. And so I did that through the church. And I double dog dared anybody to say that they were a follower of Christianity and then treat me a certain way. But that also meant that I had to, despite how they treat me, I had to extend love. So that became my platform. And so I used that platform in a way to affect change on the local level in the church. And to this day, I have a very close relationship with that pastor. And he still consults with me, and we still share in the background through emails and phone calls and direct messages. he conversed with me all the time, and it's a beautiful thing. And he even prepared a message during this season in this country. And when I listened to it and I told him, man, that was amazing. He said, when I was writing that message, I thought about a conversation we had.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, wow,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that is amazing. It is so inspiring to know that although I felt like the greatest difference I could make at Kansas State was to help an African American young woman become the first editor in chief and to, to break up the color line after you know so long at Kansas State. It's so crazy to think that from the founding to 2005 to when she became editor in chief in 2009. It's just crazy, right? But to me, the greatest gift was to be able to affect change in the community the way that I did on a local level, and to let people know that it's really okay. It's okay for us to love each other. And it's okay for us to be ignorant about one another. And it's okay for you to ask me those awkward questions, And if you stare at me, I'll smile. And so that's what helped me through it. And that's why now I can say that the bitterness is gone, because I was able to wrap myself up in love and pour that out as much as I could before I left Kansas. And it made all the difference in the world in how much I grew to love the place. It's crazy, but it's true.
You've mentioned several times, and the first African American to lead the newspaper as the editor in chief was Sheila Ellis, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. She was just a young reporter when I was there. So I
Yeah.
remember that happening. First African American, male and female. I believe one of the editors at the time was Indian.
Yes. We had an Indian. Uh huh. Yes. And Annette Lawless, who is now a television reporter or anchor
I
at this
remember
time.
Annette,
She was the
yes.
first Asian American.
That's right. That's right.
Mm.
And then 2 years before you left Kansas State, you received an award. And I want to make sure I got this right. The Robert Knight Multicultural Recruitment Award from the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communications.
Yes.
Did that, I don't know, a little bit of a leading question here. Did that validate some things for you?
Oh, God, yes. Yes, because I had gone for the Commerce Bank Award, the Multicultural Award that was given by Commerce Bank at K State. I went for it once after Sheila Ellis became editor in chief. I was completely overlooked. I wasn't even a finalist for that after all that I had endured. Um, After the fact that Sheila completely integrated the newsroom under her leadership, there was more coverage of people of color during that time than at any other time during the history of the institution. But what happened was they said Sheila did that. They didn't say that, that had anything to do with me whatsoever. Very, very hurtful. So when I received this national award, I was just floored. My husband and son and I got in the car, and we drove to Minnesota to get it. And I was literally in tears. It was like it was complete validation, and it wasn't even on a local level. It was national. So in the books, in the history of this award, my name is going to be among people from around the nation
Yeah.
who gained it. And I would have loved to have that validation on a local level, but it didn't happen. And now it doesn't matter. But yeah, for me to receive that, it meant the world to me. It really did. It meant a lot to me.
What do you want people who have heard your story up to this point, and I've learned so much that even I wasn't aware of, and I was somewhat involved in the very beginning processes of it. What do you want people to understand about you or about the situation?
I don't want people to take for granted how much their voice matters. Voice is powerful, whether it's an oral voice or whether it's a verbal voice, whether it's silence, that's still a voice. Any shape, form, or fashion of voice matters. Silence can hurt and silence can help. There's a time when we must listen, and there's a time when we must speak. Um, and we need to seek wisdom to know when either approach is more appropriate. I'd like to invite or ask or compel all people, regardless of your race or ethnicity or culture, to listen first. And don't listen with a posture to defend or to question, but listen with a posture of care, which says, I care enough to hear your story. I care enough to want to understand. I care enough to lay down my notions and preconceived thoughts, my prejudices, my ideas. I want to just be an empty slate. I want to be a channel of reception right now. And to understand that once that communication is received, there should be no pressure to have an immediate response. There should be an allowance from speaker to listener for processing. No one should feel anxious to have an answer, because the truth is, for some things, there is no answer. And sometimes the most we can do is just hear. So that's part of it. The other thing I want to say is, once processing has happened, let it be an informed process, one in which different perspectives, including one's own, has been considered. And once that happens, maybe, just maybe, we're smarter people, and we're smarter about how to navigate the tricky space between one person and the next person. Because there's always a space between people. Always, no matter how close you are, how pressed your bodies are against one another, there's always a space. And in that space, there has to be some sort of navigation. I mean, husbands and wives can be entangled in some tight embrace, but there's still an awkwardness, right? Where you've got to get kind of comfortable with one another. You kind of rearrange yourself a little bit. There's a navigation. And so the only way that we can do that, right, is through cooperation with one another. And I don't think I have more than that. And so I don't think that cooperation requires less bigotry. Isn't that a bold statement to make? Do I have to be less prejudiced to cooperate with you? Not really. Not really. Because what happens is if I decide that I have my viewpoints because my grandma and my great grandma and my great great grandma, all this stuff passed through my family to my father, and my father married a woman who has the same viewpoint, and they had this all these children and they indoctrinated all the kids, so we have all these same viewpoints. And we go to a church, and everybody in my church and my community and my forming community and my inner city community, we all have the cops are no good, and white people are privileged, and black people are lazy, and whatever the indoctrination is. Own that. If you have to own that, own it. It doesn't mean we can't cooperate. Because what happens, I mean, it colors what the cooperation looks like. I mean, if I hadn't cooperated, despite the prejudice that I encountered in the newsroom, it wasn't just about job. Nobody held me to that job at K State. I was not beholden to stay there and deal with that crap. It wasn't about not having another job to go. My skills were portable. I could have pulled up all that stuff and said, you know what? Maybe I don't have a job, but I'm going back to my mama, who's a widow right now, and I'm going to stay in her house in Houston where it's safe away from all this foolishness until I get another job. You know what, K-State? Peace out. I'm out of here. I wasn't beholden to deal with that mess, but I chose to cooperate despite how I felt, despite my own viewpoint. And through that cooperation, people learned some things about me. They could take away, you know what? Well, we gave her hell. We treated her like crap. Some of the same students who gave me the worst trouble sent me a friend request on Facebook some years later after they graduated. And I literally said to myself and said, what? Does he or she remember how they treated me? Do they remember what they said? Are you serious? Like they want to friend me of all people? Insane. But if I had left a different impression upon them because I would not cooperate, or because I gave them a hard time, or whatever the case was, then they would not have said that. There's something that I deposited in them to help them see me and perhaps other people in a light that was different from the way that they treated me. You see?
Yeah.
I mean, so I'll just say that there's a lot that we can learn from simple cooperation, despite how we feel about one person or another. And I think, like, I hate to quote Michelle Obama, but, when she said, when they go low, we go high. And I just think that's basically all that I'm saying. That's all that I'm saying. Voice is important, and be the best version of yourself at all times, no matter what other people do or say.
I got goosebumps during that, so I want to thank you so much for that. Kim, Dr. Baltrip, and I say that with the utmost respect for you and what you have done. Thank you so much for being so open and honest and sharing details. Like I said, that, as an alum of Kansas State myself, it's hard to hear those things. Mm-hmm. And, but it's real. And I would never, ever, that would never, ever cloud my judgment of your experience. And, so thank you so much for coming on and sharing that. There was a reason why I wanted you to be the first interview on this show, and you delivered 110%. So thank you so much. It has been great connecting with you again. My sincere thank you to today's guest, Kimetris Baltrip. Please do me and Kim a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might also find some value in listening to today's conversation. It's cliche in the podcasting world to ask for reviews, and I can't stand cliche questions. I can't stand cliche answers, but honestly, reviews do help all of your favorite podcasters, not just me, continue to do what they do and reach more people. So if you have it in your heart, please leave a rating and a review of this show wherever you might be listening. And if you know someone who you think would be a great guest on the follow-up question, or have a question you'd like me to address in a future episode, please email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com or go to thefollowupquestion.com/contact and submit a guest recommendation. That link is going to be in the show notes as well. If you want to improve your own ability to listen and ask questions, hop over to thefollowupquestion.com/newsletter and subscribe. And when you do, I'll send you my free guide, the 10 follow-up questions guaranteed to keep a conversation going. You'll also be the first to know about new content and fresh tips and tricks, and that's all free when you subscribe at thefollowupquestion.com/newsletter. Link is in the show notes. I will catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question, and until next time, keep asking questions.